Pete, let me start back here. Pete asked me, Pete, the leader of the mobile IPT group, asked me to do something earlier this year on mobile web. I do a lot of mobile web stuff. I'm excited about that arena, so I tried to think about what people would want to hear about, and I asked for some feedback, and a lot of people told me they were interested in responsive design. So here we are. I'm hoping to do, the reason we have a gigantic long title there, Mobile IPT, Web Applications, Responsive Web Design, is that I hope to do some other stuff on web applications in the future. Maybe some JavaScript or who knows, depending on what people are interested in. I've been getting, personally, I've been getting real deep into JavaScript stuff lately, and I'm passionate about that. So, my name is Bart Lewis. I've been working in the web since 1999, and I've been with DRC for about 10 years. 10 years this month, actually. So I've been on the web in a long time, and with DRC for quite a while as well. Like I said earlier, I do want to encourage everybody to interrupt me, ask questions, clarification. But when you're not asking a question, please, for everybody's sake, mute your line. I do hear a little bit of stuff in the background right now, so if you could mute it, I'd appreciate it. If we do end up having problems and it's distracting, I'll mute everybody and ask people to chat in. But so we were getting some crazy feedback there, so I did mute. So if you do have a question, hit me in the chat window. I'll try to keep that open on my other monitor and answer your questions there, and then I'll unmute. And we can take it from there. Also at the end, I'll unmute everybody, and we can go back and cover anything or do some Q&A at the end. Presentation's not too long. So when I first started working on the web in 1999, the two big browsers at the time were Internet Explorer 5 and Communicator 4. It was a real pain developing for both of these because they had a lot of differences. IE was really heavy with div tags, and Netscape Communicator didn't really use divs. They used something called a layer tag. When making websites for these two browsers, you had to do, they were basically two completely separate versions of code, which was obviously a pain. But as time went on, you know, and browsers came out like Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer started getting better with web standards. And then libraries like jQuery came out to smooth out even more gaps. You know, creating one set of code that ran across multiple browsers just got easier and easier. A while later, the iPhone came out, and then everything kind of went back to two versions of websites. It was a common practice for developers to build a little detection on the server that said, "Is this user coming from an iPhone? If they are, show them the code specifically for an iPhone screen, and if they're not, then show them the regular website." So this was bad because here we are back again developing two versions of the code, one for iPhone size and one for desktop size. Soon after the iPhone, Android phones started coming out, followed by iPad, Android tablets of all shapes and sizes, iPad minis. So now what the heck do we do? We want our site to look great on as many of these devices as possible, but to create a code set for each of these possible devices would just be insane. And who even knows what devices are going to come out tomorrow with what size? Today we have so many different devices with so many different screen sizes that it's hard to even count all of them. There was an interesting post I read on a Netflix tech blog last year where they said they test on 1,000 Android devices alone. And that was a year ago. That was, what, March 2012, I think it was, on the Netflix blog. So this is why we need responsive design. Screen size permutations are effectively unlimited at this point. There's just so many of them. With responsive design, we can create one set of code that responds and adapts to the screen size it's being viewed on. Ultimately what we want, one set of code. So what is responsive design? Put simply, responsive web design is an approach for creating websites and web applications that provide for an optimal viewing experience on a multitude of devices and screen sizes. In other words, the site responds or adapts to the viewport, whether that viewport is a large screen TV, an iPhone, a tablet, or anything in between. The term responsive web design was coined in 2010 by a smart guy named Ethan Marcotte, Beep on Twitter. Ethan wrote an article for the blog A List Apart where he outlined 3 basic ingredients that make up the basis of responsive web design: a fluid grid, flexible media, and CSS media queries. A fluid grid basically means that our layout should be percentage based instead of pixel based. Flexible media refers to our media being percentage based as well, and media queries allow us to define breakpoints within our design where we reflow the interface to better fit the screen size. Now I realize that's really brief and a quick description that may not make sense just yet, but bear with me. In a little bit we'll walk through implementing each of these ingredients within a sample project. So the question that always comes up with stuff on the web is it safe to use today? Can we start using it right now? For responsive web design, the answer is definitely yes. More and more companies are deploying responsive versions of their sites every day. I compiled a few examples for us to walk through and look at. Some of these I picked because they're big companies that you'll know, and others I just really like the way they were designed. So the first one here, the Boston Globe. This is one of the first really big responsive sites that came out. And I encourage you with all of these, I'll send you links, or I already did send you links actually to all of these. I'll send them to you again if you need them again. But I would encourage you to load these up in your browser and really play with them and see how they work when you squish them down or scale them up. I tried to create a mock-up here of the big version and the smallest version, but there's also versions in between all of these, for all your different tablet sizes. This site came out, or this version of the site came out in 2011. Here's another one, The Great Discontent. This is just a really gorgeous site with gigantic images. You go to this full screen view and all you see is this huge image, and then you scroll down to the article. But you can see on the phone they kind of squish it down to give you a little bit of both. And they add in the title bar on the phone version there. Starbucks. You may have heard of Starbucks. They came out with this design about a year ago. Very minimalistic, a lot of white space. Really works nice. Notre Dame has a cool design. Plus, I like their domain name there. That's about as small as you can get for a domain name. An event apart, I encourage you to look at in your browser. It's really gorgeous the way that it reflows. As your viewport or your browser window gets skinnier or larger. Also, if you're interested in learning more about this or other web stuff, they have great conferences. I think they're coming to DC pretty soon. Really good stuff. I went to one of their conferences a few years ago. Time.com is another news site you may have heard of. President Obama's website. A lot of people said his web presence and all of his fancy stuff that he did during his campaigns really helped him out a lot. Sony is another huge company that's doing responsive design. I'm not sure who put this yellow color in there, though. It's pretty awful. This one I found recently, VisitElPaso.com. This one I really encourage you to look at in your browser on your own. It's really neat the way they laid it out. They've got videos that scale up and down with the design and all kinds of stuff. Disney.com. Pretty straightforward design there. You can see how the bar collapses on the iPhone, so all you see is the Disney title. You don't have the other options. I was surprised with this one. I found this one just recently. For a company as monolithic and old as GE, they really have a great looking design. Plus they've got Agent Smith, so that helps them. And lastly, I've got Microsoft. You may have heard of Microsoft. They've got just big wide images that are really gorgeous, and they rotate out. And this one I'm going to bring up to look at just so we can see it reflow. And I don't know how well this is going to come through in the actual presentation, but we'll see. So I've loaded up in Chrome here, and you can see at the big size, that image just fills the entire screen. And then as we bring our window down, we can see changes start to happening right there. There's the bar on the left surface. As you get smaller, or now it says Office, as you get smaller, that bar now tucks underneath. And that is essentially a media query breakpoint where they've decided to reflow things. Obviously, if you are on a I'm just squishing this in the browser window to demonstrate it real quick, but if you came on a tablet, this is what you might see by default. And then as we get down to something more like a phone, you can see the product menus there, products, downloads, support. As we get down even smaller towards a phone view, that kind of gets tucked away into a drop-down menu. No, really good samples of responsive design. So, you know, these were just a few examples I picked out. I could have picked out hundreds of them. I mean, they're everywhere. If you want to look at some on your own, this is a good site. They're constantly adding stuff, and you can sort them by most liked, most recent, all kinds of stuff. And they show you all the different permutations. You can link to the site. Media queries with a fancy .es instead of a .com or a .net. Again, I sent you this link, and I can send them out again if you need it. So at this point, I'd like to walk through an example code to show how we might turn a site into a responsive format. Check my chat window. Okay. And I sent out this link to everybody ahead of time. Hopefully, if you wanted to follow along with code, you were able to download that. I can pause just for a minute here. If somebody does want to go grab that code, I'll unmute things here if I can figure that out.
The conference has been unmuted.
And while we're giving people just a second to go download some code if they want to do that, does anybody have any questions at all so far? No questions. All right. So I'll show you real quick. This is the sample site. Whoop. This is the sample site I put together and shared with everybody. You can download, see all the code. I tried to add lots of comments to it. And it'll obviously be there after the presentation as well. But we're going to look at this site and how we made this responsive. And I'll just show you again. Here's the full version. We've got like a 3-column layout. And as we go down in browser window, you can see now it's reflowed to be more of a 2-column layout. And if we go down even farther here, we've got a 1-column layout, like a phone view. So that's what we're going to be looking at. All right, I am going to mute things again. And hit...
The conference has been muted.
Again, if you have any questions during this, just enter in the chat window. I'll unmute things, and then we'll address the question too. So there is our site that we just looked at. So we've got 3 columns in this design. The HTML, and I probably should have warned everybody, there is going to be a little bit of HTML and CSS in this. We've got a few slides here walking through this code, and then some wrap-up stuff that's more higher level, non-codey. So hopefully you can make it through the code here. I'm not sure everybody's skill level. But let's look back here. So 3 columns. We've got a title, we've got 3 columns, we've got a footer. In HTML, it might look something like this. We've got our container tag that wraps everything. And then we've got 3 divs inside there for column A, column B, and column C. Column A and column C have that text on the left and right. And in column B, it's just our image. So for this exercise, I'm going to make an assumption just to simplify things a little bit and say we designed our site in Photoshop to be 960 pixels. starting with that assumption. You know, that's a safe default on the web, maybe a little small now, but still pretty safe. If you design your site at 960, you're going to fit well on everybody's monitor. So breaking down that 960 into kind of a grid layout, we have 298 pixels for each column, and then two gutters in between the columns, 33 pixels each. And if we add all those up, that's 960, so that's going to fit well on the screen. These numbers could have been anything. It's all based on your design. These 298 pixels and 33 pixels and even 960 are not magic numbers by any means. It's just what I picked for our example. So we looked at the HTML, 3 columns, 3 divs, and our CSS to go along with that HTML might look like this initially. Again, at this point, we've got our container at 960. Column A, column B, and column C all defined with a width of 298. And then I used margin right on columns A and B to define our gutter. So 298 times 3 columns plus 33 pixel gutter times 2, that equals our 960 pixels. The other thing to note here is the float left. And all that's doing, if you're not familiar with CSS, is saying I want all my divs to be on one line. The natural order of a div is to break to the next line, and a float overrides that and tells them all to stay together. So if we loaded up this in our browser window right now, it would look exactly how we want it to look. It would look like this, which is our desired result. But the question is, what happens if somebody visits our site with a browser window that's smaller than that, or with a tablet, or with a phone? And this is what's going to happen. We're going to get scroll bars. It's respecting that 960 pixels that we defined, and it just adds the scroll bars to compensate, which of course looks ugly. Nobody wants horizontal scroll bars. Horizontal scroll bars are evil. So let's take a look at our CSS again and see what we can do. So the first thing we're going to do is implement our first ingredient that we talked about earlier, those 3 ingredients of responsive web design, a fluid grid. And the fluid grid seems like a scary word. When I first heard that, I choked a little bit, but it's really not too bad. All it really means is we're going to change it from pixels to percentages, but keeping the same ratios that we have right here now. And then everything's going to be fluid. So there's an easy formula here, and you don't need to remember this. This is real easy to Google and find. But the easiest way to do it is to convert a fixed pixel width design to a fluid design is just say the item width divided by max width times 100, and that'll give you your percentage. Our columns, we said, were 298. Our interface is 960, so if we plug those in, we get a column width of about 31%. And then our gutters, we'll do the same thing. We said our gutters were 33 pixels, our interface is 960, and that gives us a width of about 3.4. So we can just plug these into our CSS. We added our width. Instead of the 298 pixels, it's now about 31%. And our margin right, which is our gutter, was 33 pixels. Now it's 3.4%. The other change we made here on the container that you might have noticed, the container tag up there towards the top, is we changed it from width equals 960 to max width equals 960. And the difference is when it's width, it's always going to be 960, but when it's max width, that basically tells the code, don't get bigger than 960, but it's okay to be smaller. That's what the max is. So now if we loaded this in our browser window and we squished it down, we don't have that horizontal scroll bar anymore. It is squishing down these columns because they're based on percentages now instead of fixed pixels. So it maintains the ratio, which is exactly what we want to start happening. The problem with this is, as you can tell, is the image is fixed width. The column that the image is in is that 31% still. But the image that's inside there is still a fixed width, so it's kind of breaking out of the bounds of its column. So that's going to be the next ingredient that we're going to implement, which is fluid media. In this case, media is our image. And this turns out to be really, really simple to do. So the only change we've got to make in order to make our image fluid instead of fixed is in the HTML we take out the width and height. So it's just not defined with any. All we have is the source that points to the source image, and that's it. Then in our CSS, just like we gave the interface a max width of 960, now here we can use max width to give the image a max of 100. And what does that mean? That means that our image is going to match the width of the column. And our column is percentage based, so now our image is effectively percentage based as well, matching the column. And which has the result that you see here. So now our columns reach that 31%. Our image is 100% of the width of the column, so it looks like we have 3 even columns here. And we do have 3 even columns. More than looks like it. So regardless of the screen size used to view this, you're always going to have these 3 nicely spaced columns. You can stretch your browser window in and out. You can visit it on a tablet. The columns are going to maintain that ratio that we set. And this is definitely a lot better than what we had before. But we've only implemented 2 ingredients at this point, and you're going to see why here in just a minute. As the viewport gets smaller and smaller, this layout is going to start to break down. I mean, those columns are just going to get really, 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 really skinny. That image is going to get tiny. There's going to be tons of white space below it, and it's just going to be kind of ridiculous. And here you can kind of see that going on here. It's doing exactly what we told it to, and it is better, but it's starting to become a broken user experience. So that's where our third ingredient is going to come in, media queries. Media queries essentially allow you to write conditional statements within your CSS. If-then statements are pretty common in all programming languages. If a particular condition is true, perform some action. For our case, media queries can be thought of in the same way. When a given statement is true, run the code within. The big difference between CSS and the JavaScript conditions here is that in JavaScript we're performing an action when a condition is true. And in the CSS we're applying certain styles when a condition is true. We're going to override certain CSS styles. Media queries can take all kinds of conditional tests, but for responsive web design, the one we're usually concerned with is the width. And again, we're going to target that max width. So, through some trial and error, I've determined that our viewing experience really starts to break down when the viewport, that is the browser window, gets to about 700 pixels wide. So our first breakpoint, our first media query, is going to be at 700 pixels. At this viewport size, 2 columns in our layout would look much better than 3. This would give more width to each text and make the image better, get rid of some of that white space, so we'll see how we can implement that with a media query. And this is kind of what we want to do. We're going to have the first column, just let it stretch the width of the web page. And then columns B and C are each going to be about 50%, but we still have to have that gutter in between them. So we can put a media query at the bottom of our CSS file for this breakpoint. And it's going to have a condition of 700 pixels. Whenever the viewport is less than 700 pixels, the styles within that media query will be applied to the document, overriding any of the styles we had previously set. You can see on this page I put in the code that we're going to override. This is the style we already set, columns A, B, and C, width 31%. And the styles we're going to put in there, the first thing we're going to do, rather, is give column A a width of 100%. If you remember in, let me zap back a couple screens. So here, the layout we want to achieve. Previous to this, all the columns were about that 31%. What we want to do is set column A to 100, column B to 50, and column C to 50. So this is all the code we need to override column A with a width of 100%. So now the next problem is going to be, the code that we don't have here is we haven't yet overridden the width of the other column. So column A is going to be 100%. That's going to stretch the width of the screen and drop everything down to the next line. That's exactly what we want. But the next 2 columns, B and C, are still going to be 31%. So what's going to happen is they're going to be tucked off to the left, and there's going to be a whole bunch of white space to the right. So our next task is to give them that about 50% width. But the question is, what is that number? We can't just put 50 because, you know, there is a gutter. So the easiest way to determine what that width should be is if we kind of rewind a little bit and think again about that 960 magic number. So we're going to figure our new column widths for B and C. And we know that column B plus that 33 pixel gutter, assuming we leave the gutter size alone, plus column C is going to be equal to 960. So, you know, going back to thinking in fixed width pixels for a minute, we've determined that our columns B and C are 463.5 pixels. And then we can plug those into that that percentage to turn them in, or that equation to turn them into a percentage, which lets us know that about 50% is in reality 48.3-ish. So now we can plug this this percentage back into our CSS. So we've added a new CSS rule within our media query that overrides the widths for columns B and C. Notice that we did not have to specify the gutter width within this media query. The gutter width hasn't changed, we left it alone, so there's nothing to override there. Also note that while we are overriding the widths of columns B and C, the float for these columns that we specified earlier is still in effect. We're only overriding that one property, the width. So up at the top you can see there's our original CSS, float left width 31. And then within our conditional CSS, when the screen is less than 700, change column A to a width of 100, margin right 0, kill that gutter, and then columns B and C, override those widths to 48. So what we've got here is what the screen looked like before we added this media query, and then after. You can see on the left, all those gutters have that 31, or not gutters, rather, the columns have that 31%. And then over on the right, column A, 100%, and no gutter, which means it stretches the width of the screen. And then columns B and column C are 48% of the screen, and they still have that gutter in between them. And I'll go back and look at the CSS. I mean, that's all the CSS under the media query. That's all we needed to reflow our screen from that 3-column layout into kind of more of a magazine 2-column layout. Not much CSS at all. The hard part is those equations and remembering, figuring out what those percentages are. But once you have those, you plug them in, and then it's not much code at all. So we're going to create one more breakpoint within our project. When the screen gets really, really small, say 500 pixels, we want to adjust our layout down to a single column. Like some of the examples we saw earlier, it's a common thing for, you know, if you're on an iPhone or even a smaller Android phone, it's very common to just throw everything into one column. On the left here we've got 3 columns, on the right we've got 1 and then 2 columns, and then our third breakpoint, which is, you know, quote-unquote phone layout, we're going to throw everything into one column. And at about 500 pixels, that'll work nicely. So we're going to have a second media query. This goes under our other media query, where we're going to define when the screen is 500 pixels or less, just take all the columns to 100% and kill the margins completely, or the gutters. And this is going to give us one stacked row of all of those texts. And here I've split this up into 2 screenshots just to show you because it is so long. But this is one screen, and you can see there's the first column, there's that text over on the left, and then our image, and then our third column in one long line. So here's all of our breakpoints together. We converted this page into a fluid grid, made the images fluid, and added 2 breakpoints. The first screenshot up at the top left, you know, that's our large screen, our default large screen view when somebody visits in a large desktop. Our second breakpoint was at 700 pixels. That's probably what someone on a tablet is going to see when they come by default. And then our third long skinny view is what someone might see if they visit the site on a phone. And again, the power of this is just, that's all one code set. The only difference is those few lines of CSS to say when the screen gets smaller, do this, when it gets smaller, do this. So the process we just went through within this example is what's considered a desktop first approach. That is, we started with a default layout of a large screen and then added breakpoints as we go down smaller and smaller. If you've been following responsive web design at all, a popular buzzword lately is a mobile-first approach. And that's really kind of gaining traction lately. I haven't experimented with it too much, besides reading a little bit. But it's really the same process, only in reverse. With mobile first, your default layout is more centered around your small screen experience. And then you add media queries as the viewport gets larger and larger. So you would start everything off with one column, and everything's got 100% width, for example, in our case. And then you might write a media query that says, when 700 pixels, change it to 2 columns. When 960 pixels, change it to the 3 columns. So it's really the same thing we did, but backwards. And I don't think one approach is more correct than the other. I think it really just depends on your project, what you want your safe defaults to be. Both of them are going to get you to the same endpoint. So what about browser support? The first two ingredients, our Fluid Grid and our Fluid Media, are going to work in pretty much any browser you can think of. Our final ingredient that we use to create those breakpoints, media queries, its support is a little bit more spotty. Chrome has supported media queries since its inception. Firefox down to 3.5, pretty old. Safari back to 4, mostly old. But the one wrench in the works, as always, is Internet Explorer. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of users on IE7 and IE8, even some still on IE6. And this is especially true with some of our government clients. However, none of this really matters. We don't care. You can still use responsive design techniques, even if you need to support IE8 and lower. And here's why. How many of your users do you think use Internet Explorer 8 on their iPhone? Or how many use Internet Explorer 7 on their Nexus? None. Overwhelmingly, smartphones and tablets have very good browsers. In just about all cases, media queries are going to work just fine on these devices, which is the whole point. If we use the desktop first approach, as we did in our example just now, when a user visits our site with a browser that doesn't support media queries, like one of these old IE browsers, they're going to get the full desktop experience by default. And that's going to be okay. Because that user with IE8 is obviously sitting on a desktop machine. They're not running IE8 on their tablet. And we don't ever need to go down to that single column layout. So they just get that safe default of a desktop view, which they're used to seeing. So again, I'm going to go back to the question from the beginning of the presentation and ask, what is responsive design? Hopefully this gives you a little bit better of an idea of how to implement it and what it is than you had before. We looked at why you'd want to use responsive design in the first place. We justified using it by looking at some of the big company names that are already using it in production. And we looked deeper into the 3 ingredients of what makes up a responsively designed site. The web is a platform. It's a platform I'm passionate about. It is unarguably the most widely available platform for smartphones, tablets, computers, TVs, more and more devices every day. The web allows us to build one code set and deploy to virtually any web-connected device. Responsive design is the sugar on top of that web application that makes it look and feel like it was made specifically for whatever device is being used, regardless of the screen size of that device. If you're interested in digging a little deeper into the subject, one of the first sources of material I'd recommend are these 2 books from A Book Apart. They're very small books. You can read it in a few hours, but they give you just what you need to get started and going without bogging you down in a bunch of dry material. They even have a deal on the site. I provided a link that I sent out earlier where you can buy both of these together for a reduced price, digital or hardback, whichever you like, or paperback, I guess. Another good resource I use a lot is CSStricks.com. They've got all kinds of articles for this kind of stuff and all kinds of webby things. And the guy that does CSS Tricks also has a podcast called Shop Talk. If podcasts are your thing, that's worth checking out. I listen to that now and then. And then beyond these resources, there's tons of tutorials and courses. Tuts Plus, Treehouse, Code School. All these kinds of sites have just tons of responsive design stuff if you want to dig deeper, and a lot of them are free still.